I want you to imagine just for a minute that you're sitting in church on a Sunday morning. The room is full. The worship team has finished. The pastor walks onto the stage, but something just feels different. He takes a deep breath. His voice is shaking. Then he says, I have something I need to tell you. And within the next 10 minutes, everything changes. The lies, the secret life, the affair. The person everyone trusted suddenly feels like a stranger. People quietly leave the sanctuary. The conversations all sound the same. I can't believe it. He seems so honest. How could this happen? Maybe you've watched something like this unfold. Maybe it wasn't your pastor. Maybe it was a friend, a coworker, a family member, or someone you admired from a distance. Whenever someone falls in a big public way, we almost always ask the same question. How could they do something like that? But today, I want to ask a different question, one that's honestly a little more uncomfortable. What if the greatest threat to your character isn't temptation, but it's believing you're the kind of person who would never give into it? Because the moment we become convinced that we would never, we stop paying attention, we stop guarding our hearts, we stop noticing little compromises. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. Very few people wake up one morning and decide to ruin their lives. Most people drift there. One compromise, one rationalization, one justification at a time. And that's what we're talking about today. Not why bad people do things, but how ordinary good people, people who genuinely love God, can slowly become someone they never imagined they could be. In our last episode, we talked about how bad people can become good, or whether or not humanity was capable of that kind of a change. But this week, we're talking about the opposite, how good, wholesome people can end up ruining their lives. And I've seen it many times. There's actually a name for this. A psychologist named Albert Bandura spent years studying a question that sounds surprisingly familiar. Not why are some people evil, but how do ordinary people slowly begin doing things that they once believed was wrong? His answer changed the way that I read the Bible, because once I understood it, I started seeing it everywhere. In David, in Peter, in Judas, in the Pharisees, and if I'm being honest, in myself. So what happened? How does someone slowly become the person they once judged? Because let's be honest, none of us are worried about waking up tomorrow and deciding to rob a bank. And if you are, you should probably pause this episode and reevaluate some things. Most of us don't make catastrophically bad decisions before breakfast. Life usually doesn't work like that. Instead, we do something much smaller. We tell ourselves a story. Maybe you've noticed this in your own life. Have you ever caught yourself saying, I'm not angry, I'm just passionate? Or I'm not being controlling, I just like things done the right way, which for the record usually means your way. Or maybe this one, I'm not procrastinating, I just work better under pressure. No, you work because you're under pressure. Those are not the same thing. And don't look at me like you've never cleaned your entire house the night before a deadline, because suddenly the baseboards become rather fascinating. We've all been here, and here's what's interesting. Those little stories we tell ourselves don't usually feel dishonest. They feel reasonable. That's what makes them so dangerous. Nobody wakes up and says, today, I'd like to become a hypocrite. Instead, they say, this one exception won't matter. Then they make another exception and another until eventually the exception becomes the rule. Now, Albert Bandura studied this exact phenomenon. He wanted to answer the question that had puzzled psychologists for decades of how do ordinary people, and we're not talking about psychopaths or serial killers, or comic book villains with dramatic evil laughs, just ordinary, regular people end up doing things they once believed were wrong. His conclusion was simple. People don't usually abandon their morals overnight. They slowly disconnect them from their behavior. He called it moral disengagement. Now, don't let the fancy term deter you. It's actually something you've probably already experienced. Moral disengagement is what happens when we change the story instead of changing the behavior. Instead of saying, I lied, we say, oh, I just left out a few details. Instead of saying, I gossiped, it's, you really should be praying for them, which is amazing, isn't it? Prayer requests have somehow become the unofficial witness protection program for gossip. I'm only telling this so you can pray for them. Meanwhile, you've accidentally shared their entire autobiography. Or maybe it's, I'm not bitter. I'm just having trouble letting go. Sometimes we don't even realize we're writing the story. We're just trying to feel okay. And here's what really caught my attention. Bandura wasn't studying criminals. He was studying all of us, regular people, because every human being has this incredible ability to protect their self-image. We want to see ourselves as good people, so when our behavior doesn't match the kind of person we believe we are, something has to give. We can either change our behavior or we can change the story. And if I'm being honest, changing the story is usually easier. Have you ever noticed how quickly we become defense attorneys for ourselves and prosecutors for everyone else? When I cut someone off in traffic, I'm like, I was in a hurry. When someone cuts me off, I'm quick to say, oh, apparently they got their driver's license from a cereal box. Same behavior, very different explanation. Or maybe that's just me. We naturally give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. We know our intentions. We know how stressed we were. We know what kind of day we've had. But everyone else, we only see their actions and suddenly they're that kind of person. Jesus had a way of cutting right through that. He said, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye while ignoring the plank in your own? I love that image because it's almost funny. Picture someone trying to help another person out, remove a speck of sawdust while they've got what amounts to a telephone pole sticking out of their own face. It's absurd, but that's the point. Jesus had a way of exposing self-deception without humiliating people. He invited us to examine our own hearts first, and maybe that's exactly where this conversation needs to go. Because before we start asking how they drifted, we probably need to ask a harder question. Where am I telling myself stories that are keeping me from seeing my own truth? So how does this actually happen? How do good, ordinary people slowly justify things they once called wrong? It usually doesn't start with a bad decision. It starts with a really good reason. Think about that. Almost every compromise comes with an explanation. Oh, I'm just trying to protect their feelings. I didn't want to start a fight. I deserve this after the week I've had. It's only temporary, or I'll stop after this. The reason always sounds reasonable. That's what makes it so convincing. And here's something I've noticed about temptation. It almost never introduces itself honestly. Temptation doesn't show up and say, hi, I'm here to wreck your life. Thought I'd stop by around lunchtime if that's good. If it did, we'd slam the door in its face. Instead, it says, this isn't a big deal. Nobody's going to know. You deserve to be happy, or you've been under a lot of stress. It's not hurting anyone. It speaks our language. It appeals to our emotions. It tells us exactly what we already want to hear, and if we're not careful, we start believing it. Have you ever had one of those conversations where you know you're wrong, but somehow by the end of the conversation, you've convinced yourself you're actually the victim, or you're the one that's right? No, just me. Okay, that's cool. But it's amazing how quickly we can build a case for ourselves. We become, like I said, our own defense attorney. Well, technically, if they hadn't done such and such, or, well, you don't understand the whole story. And maybe all that's true. Maybe there is more to the story. But have you ever noticed how rarely we're that generous with other people? When someone else messes up, we judge them by what they did. But when we mess up, we judge ourselves by what we meant to do. It's a pretty convenient arrangement if you ask me. But Jesus told a story. He said 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee stood there thanking God that he wasn't like everyone else. Thank you that I'm not greedy or dishonest or immoral. I can almost hear him saying, at least I'm not that guy. And then there's the tax collector. He won't even lift his eyes. All he can say is, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It's one of the most surprising stories Jesus ever told because the religious leader looked righteous. The tax collector admitted he wasn't. And Jesus said the tax collector went home justified. Why? Because self-awareness is the beginning of transformation. The Pharisee had disengaged from his own heart. He could see everyone else's sin, but not his own. That might be one of the scariest parts of moral disengagement. It doesn't make us feel like worse people. It makes us feel like better people. We become experts at finding flaws in everyone else and beginners at recognizing our own. And I don't know about you, but that's uncomfortable because it's easy to listen to an episode like this and picture someone else because maybe somebody else's face has already popped into your mind. You're thinking, man, I hope they're listening. I wish I could send it to them, but that might be rude. But I hate to disappoint you, but this episode isn't about them. It's about us, which is honestly less fun, but probably more useful. One of my favorite quotes says, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. But how true is that? Nobody has to work very hard to convince me of what I already want to believe. If I want to buy an expensive gadget, I suddenly become an expert in why it's a necessary investment. If I want dessert, somehow I remember reading an article about the health benefits of dark chocolate. Never mind that what I'm eating barely qualifies as chocolate anymore. It's mostly caramel. But the point is, we all do this. Our brains naturally look for evidence that supports what we already want. Psychologists call it confirmation bias. Scripture calls it something different. It says the heart is deceitful. And those identities aren't identical, but they point us toward the same reality. Human beings are remarkably skilled at convincing in themselves that they are right. And that's why the proverb says, above all else, guard your heart. Not because your heart is always evil, but because it's easily influenced. It's shaped by what you repeatedly feed it. Every compromise, every justification, every story you tell yourself is forming your character. The question isn't whether you're being formed. You are. The question is who or what is doing the forming. And that's where I think David's story becomes so incredibly important, because David didn't wake up one morning and just decide, I'm going to become an adulterer. He did become one, not in a single decision, but through a series of small ones that on their own didn't seem all that dangerous. So let's go back and look at that story a little more closely. But before we do that, I want to point out one of the wonderful things about Scripture is that it doesn't sanitize people. If the Bible were trying to convince us that everyone in it was a hero, it did a terrible job. Noah gets drunk, Jonah runs from God, Peter denies Jesus, Moses loses his temper, and David gives us one of the most heartbreaking stories in the entire Bible. And I think it's heartbreaking because David wasn't just some random guy. This is David, the giant killer, the shepherd, the man after God's own heart, the songwriter, the king. If anyone should have been immune to moral collapse, you'd probably put David somewhere near the top of the list. But that's exactly why his story matters, because David's greatest failure didn't begin in a bedroom. It began long before that. The Bible gives us a detail that's so easy to skip over. In 2 Samuel 11, it says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David remained in Jerusalem. Have you ever read that or heard that? It just kept going. I did for years, and it almost sounds like, because to me, it almost sounds like a narrator just giving us the weather forecast. And it was springs, and kings were at war, and David was home. Okay, why does that matter? Because the author could have just started with Bathsheba. Instead, he wants us to know where David was, or possibly where David wasn't. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. Now, before we turn this into some prosperity sermon about staying in God's will, let's slow down. The text doesn't say David sinned by staying home. He simply tells us something changed. His routine changed, his responsibilities changed, and his environment changed. And sometimes those moments deserve our attention because most of us don't drift when everything in life is stable. We drift during transitions. When we're lonely, when we're exhausted, when we're grieving, when we're successful. And the last one surprises people because success can be just as spiritually dangerous as suffering. Sometimes more, because success whispers, you've got this. Everything is right where it's supposed to be. While suffering reminds us that we don't have everything and we don't got this. So David stays home. One evening, he can't sleep. He walks out onto the roof again. Nothing sinful yet. I've had nights I couldn't sleep. I'm sure you have too. So you walk outside, you get some fresh air, you clear your head. Nothing wrong with that. Then David sees Bathsheba. Again, not necessarily a sin. You can't always control what catches your attention or what comes before your eyes, but you can control what continues to keep your attention. And that's where the story begins to shift. David doesn't just notice her, he keeps looking. Then he asks about her. Then someone tells him exactly who she is. She's married. Not only that, she's married to one of David's most loyal soldiers. And at that moment, the story could have ended. David had all the information he needed to make the right decision. Instead, he sends for her, and here's where it strikes me every time I read this story. There isn't one moment where David suddenly becomes a different person. There are dozens of little moments where he chooses not to turn back. One decision, then another, until eventually he's standing somewhere he probably never imagined he'd be. Have you ever gone hiking? I have this terrible habit. I'll be walking down a trail, looking at scenery, enjoying myself, and then I realize I've wandered off the path. Not dramatically. I didn't take a sharp left turn into the woods. I just slowly followed the ground that seemed easiest to walk on. A few steps here, a few steps there, and after a while, the trail is over there, and I'm over here. Life works like that too. Almost nobody wakes up and says, today I'm going to abandon my values. We just stop paying attention to where our next step is leading us. That's why I don't think the most dangerous sentence in the English language is I don't believe in God. I think it's this one little compromise won't matter. Because one compromise rarely stays alone. Compromise has a way of inviting friends. One lie needs another lie. One secret needs another secret. One rationalization creates room for another. And before long, you're working harder to protect the lie than you ever would have worked to tell the truth. And the crazy part is, by this point, David probably still thought of himself as a good man. He didn't wake up thinking, I'm the villain in this story. Nobody ever does. I think that's one of the reasons Jesus spent so much time talking about the heart, because behavior is easy to notice. The drift underneath, not so much. Jesus says things like, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. In other words, our actions don't come out of nowhere. They grew from something, just like fruit grows from a tree. And if that's true, then the goal isn't just managing our behavior. The goal is paying attention to what's happening beneath the surface, long before anybody else can see it. Because the uncomfortable question, if David, a man after God's own heart, could drift, what makes us think we're immune? Not because we're destined to fail, but because we're all human. And maybe the safest people aren't the ones who say, I'd never do that. Because they're the ones who quietly pray, Lord, keep my heart close to yours. So when we talk about people doing things that they never thought they would, one of the biggest things that comes to mind, or some of the biggest things, is adultery, addiction, just destructions of family. And I want to take a second to talk about this because in my line of work, I've met a lot of addicts, and I have found that there's a lot of people that don't have a whole lot of compassion for them because in their mind, well, you chose to be this way. You're choosing to do those drugs, or you're choosing to drink that alcohol, or whatever their addiction may be. And I agree to some extent, but I also would say that nobody wakes up one day and says, I want to be a blackout drunk. Nobody wakes up and says, I want to be so incredibly addicted to heroin that I cannot even stand up, or I feel like I'm going to die if I don't have it. People imagine addiction beginning with the drug. It usually doesn't. It often, very, very often, begins with pain. It begins with loneliness, stress, trauma, depression, then an escape, and then relief, and then repetition becomes habit, and the habit becomes dependence. And eventually the brain literally changes. No, at that point, you're not simply just making bad choices. You're fighting neural pathways that have been strengthened thousands of times. That's why addiction is so complicated. It's moral, but it's also biological, it's psychological, it's spiritual, it's all of the above. It's not one of those things. Take affairs, for instance. Everyone's like, oh, I would never cheat on my spouse. And I would hope that that would be true, but affairs happen all the time. And some of them are just plain people don't care, and they don't care how their behavior affects other people, but there are so many affairs out there that begin from loving spouses who never could have imagined that they would ever do that, because affairs almost never begin in a hotel room. They begin in conversations. Psychologist Shirley Glass wrote extensively about this. She described affairs as often developing through a gradual erosion of boundaries, where emotional intimacy shifts from one spouse to someone else. Maybe it looks like this. They're just a coworker. Then, well, they're really easy to talk to. Then it becomes they just understand me. Then I can't tell my spouse because they'd misunderstand. And that's when the secrets begin. Long before the affair is just simply the visible fruit of what's been growing. The roots have been growing underground for months. No little girl grows up hoping to become the other woman, right? No little boy dreams of becoming an unfaithful husband. Nobody puts that on their vision board. My goal for the year is to be a homewrecker. Nobody does that. One of the biggest predictors of behavior like that is normalization. We become comfortable with what we repeatedly experience. It's why flirting becomes harmless. Pornography becomes normal. Gambling just becomes, it's just entertainment. And drinking just becomes coping because exposure changes perception. Habituation is fascinating. The first cigarette feels strange. The 50th, not so much. The first lie about something, it just feels awful and you feel guilty and yucky. But by the 50th, the lie barely registers. Our brains habituate, meaning we stop noticing, and that's a terrifying place to be. I love the concept of incremental escalation. It just means that people tolerate slightly more, and then slightly more than that, and then slightly more than that. Imagine turning up a thermostat 1 degree every hour. You'd never notice, and that's the way character works. It causes self-deception. And this is where theology shines, because Jeremiah says the heart is deceitful and abundantly wicked, but who could know it? Psychology says humans have confirmation bias, self-serving bias, motivated reasoning, cognitive dissonance. Very similar observation. We're incredibly good at lying, especially to ourselves. Proverbs says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. I find that fascinating because it doesn't say guard your reputation. It doesn't say guard your career. It doesn't even say guard your marriage. It says guard your heart. Why? Because long before our lives fall apart on the outside, something has usually been happening on the inside. Character almost always collapses before reputation does. We just don't see it. Think about the house with a cracked foundation. From the street, it looks beautiful, fresh paint, nice landscaping, everything appears perfectly fine. But underneath the foundation has been shifting for years. Then one day a wall cracks and people see a crack and think, oh my, what happened? The crack didn't happen that day. It was simply the first visible sign of a problem that had been developing for years. And I wonder if that's why public failures are so shocking. We see the crack. We don't see the years of pressure underneath it. And that's true whether you're talking about addiction, an affair, financial dishonesty, or walking away from faith. The visible moment is rarely the beginning of the story. It's usually the chapter where everyone else finally notices. I've noticed something else, though. When someone falls in a big way, we almost instinctively separate ourselves from them. We say things like, oh, I could never do that. I'd never cheat on my spouse. I could never become an addict. I'd never steal from my company. And I understand why we say that. We want to believe there's a clear line between those people and people like us. But what if that's the wrong way to think about it? Because the danger isn't usually waking up one morning and making a catastrophic decision. The danger is becoming the kind of person for whom that decision slowly starts to make sense. And that's what scares me. Not because I think we're all destined to fail, but because none of us are above drifting. Have you ever driven somewhere you've been 100 times only to realize you didn't remember the last 10 minutes of the drive? Your brain just kind of goes into autopilot. You're still making decisions. You're still turning the wheel. You're still stopping at red lights, but you're really not thinking about it, life can be like that too. We don't just build habits, our habits begin building us. James Clear says every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. I love that idea because it works both ways. Every small act of integrity is a vote for becoming a person of integrity. But every small compromise is also casting a vote, not because one decision defines you, but because repeated decisions define you. Not because repeated decisions shape you. Psychologists have been telling us for decades, neural pathways strengthen with repetition, habits become automatic. Our brains become more efficient at doing whatever we've practiced most, and that's both incredibly hopeful and very sobering because it means no choice is ever just a choice. Every choice is also practice. Practice for the kind of person you're becoming, and practice makes perfect. So you better be careful what kind of person you're practicing to become. But maybe that's why Jesus cared so much about the heart. He wasn't just interested in behavior. He was interested in formation because behavior can be managed for a while. Character eventually shows up, and when life squeezes us, what's been formed inside of us has a way of coming out. Not because pressure changes us overnight, but because pressure reveals what we've been becoming all along. That, to me, is the really sobering part. Not that people suddenly become addicts or adulterers or dishonest. It's that they slowly become people who can justify one more compromise, one more secret, one more boundary cross, until one day they wake up and wonder, how did I get here? And maybe the answer isn't one terrible decision. Maybe it's 1,000 tiny ones that never felt big enough to matter. So where does that leave us? Maybe you're listening today and you're thinking, well, I've never had an affair. I've never struggled with addiction. I've never stolen from anyone. And honestly, I am grateful and I hope you never do. But I think this episode is really not about affairs or addiction. Those are just visible examples. The real question is much simpler. Who am I becoming? Because whether we realize it or not, every day is shaping us. Every conversation, every habit, every relationship, every thought we choose to dwell on, every story we tell ourselves, none of those moments feel very significant on their own, but together they're writing a story of our lives. One of the things I love most about the gospel is that it doesn't just warn us about drift, it also gives us hope, because the same God who says, guard your heart, is the same one who promises, I will give you a new heart. God isn't standing at a distance waiting for you to figure it out or waiting for you to fail. He's inviting us into a relationship that transforms us from the inside out. And that's why Christianity has never been about behavior management. It's about heart transformation. And that's the encouragement somebody needs to hear today. If small compromises can slowly shape a life, then so can small acts of faithfulness. One honest confession, one difficult conversation, one boundary that needed to be set, one apology, one day of sobriety, one decision to ask for help, one prayer when you don't feel like praying. Those things may seem small, but so did the compromises. So never underestimate the power of small things repeated over time, because that's how people drift, but it's also how people heal. I think about Peter. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. If we had ended his story there, we probably would have said, well, I guess Peter who wasn't who we thought he was. But God wasn't finished writing Peter's story. He's not finished writing yours either. Maybe you've drifted. Maybe you've crossed lines you never imagined you would cross. Maybe you're carrying shame over choices that still keep you up at night. But hear me when I say this. Your drift does not have to define your destination. One of the enemy's greatest lies is you've gone too far to come back. The gospel says, come home. Not after you've cleaned yourself up, not after you've earned another chance, but now. So maybe the question isn't, could I ever become that person? Maybe the better question is, what kind of person am I becoming today? Because today is all any of us have. Today I can tell the truth. Today I can confess instead of conceal. Today I can ask for help. Today I can ask for forgiveness. Today I can choose integrity in the little things. And tomorrow I'll do it again. If there's one thing I hope you remember from this conversation, it's this. Nobody drifts toward Christ by accident, but no one drifts away overnight either. Both happen one small step at a time. So pay attention to the little things, not because you're trying to earn God's love, but because the little things are quietly shaping the person you're becoming. So thank you for spending this time with me today. If this episode challenged you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's one small compromise that our culture tells us is no big deal? Or maybe what's one small habit that has helped you grow closer to God? You can send me a message, leave me a comment. I genuinely love hearing your perspectives. But until next time, take care of your mind, take care of your soul, and take care of yourself.